Welcome to Soul Thrive, where we explore spirituality through healing trauma, shadow work, and applying the laws of the universe in order to master ourselves without the fear of the unknown. Hi, Diana. We're so excited to have you on the Soul Thrive podcast. It's just nice because you're a Soul Thrive member as well, and we've been doing the work for such a long time, but I really, really love what you do. So with that said, I'm going to just give you the intro to yourself. You can create your own intro, whatever you want to communicate to others to let them know how you do, and what you do.
Thank you. Anyone who knows me knows I love podcasts. I devour them all. Love yours. And I also love talking about what I do. So this is the first podcast I've ever been on.
Forever.
So two of my loves mixed together, which is really great. So I am a pediatric physiotherapist, which means I'm a physiotherapist who specializes in children. I see age 0 all the way to 18. I started my career, the first decade, working in the public sector. So in children's treatment centers for a little while in North Bay, which is where I lived at the time. I moved there for my job, actually. And then I came home. This is the area that I live in, the GTA. And then about 3 years ago, almost, I switched to the private sector, which means I'm in private practice now and have been for almost 3 years. So I see a wide range of children with different abilities and for different kinds of conditions. So for when I worked in the public sector for that first decade, I pretty much only saw children with special needs. And then since moving to private practice, there's still some of that, but now it's shifted a little bit. Primarily what I see are babies who have delays or some kind of side preferences, but I also see older children with any kind of movement struggles, balance, coordination, that kind of thing. I also see children who are struggling with constipation, urinary incontinence, bedwetting, tiptoe walkers. A really wide range and much more, a really wide range of skills and abilities and struggles. And the best part about it, in my opinion, is I get to play all day because my assessments and my treatments are always supposed to be play-based and informative and supportive for the family and the children as possible.
Oh, love that. Love all of that. That's amazing. All right. I know she's got questions ready for you.
I know.
I just go with the flow. She's the Virgo Pisces dynamic here. Right?
Yeah, fellow Pisces. So
yeah, I love it. No, and I love the information that you already provided about yourself. So I have so many questions that I want to ask. Well, first of all, it must be super empowering to actually work with children to help them reach their highest potential. But there's a couple of things that you mentioned. One is about not comparing children. Reaching their milestones, and just helping parents sort of be more comfortable to ask questions, to ask for support. But I'm curious because comparison is something we often talk about even in our workshops. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and just how do you work with parents to sort of help them on this journey of getting their children to be in their potential and to develop physically and mentally?
I love that question. And it's something that I'm probably the most passionate about because there is an oversaturation, I would say, of information in some regards. So a lot of people on social media are, sharing where their kid's at. Every little milestone their child achieves, they're sharing that, which is beautiful. I did the same. You're excited for your child, right? But then if your child's struggling with something, and you see your best friend or someone else, or even a stranger on social media showing where their child is at, of course, you're going to feel worried, maybe unsure about how you're helping your child reach their milestones, especially in first-time parents. And I jokingly say when a family comes to me for an initial assessment, I can tell whether it's their first child or not just within the first few minutes of our conversation, because a lot of the times I can sense that there's a heightened anxiety or unknowing, am I doing this right? Am I doing everything that I can, to support my child as they, move through their life? And I tell families, just like I had to remind myself, even when I had a second child, every child is going to reach those milestones at their own time. And I I'm a lot less worried, and this is what I say verbatim probably 100 times a day. I'm a lot less worried about the timing of milestones than I am more the order. So if you're telling me that your friend's baby rolled at 4 or 5 months and yours is 5 or 6 and is still struggling, that's not so much of a worry for me. It's more like, okay, well, tell me what your baby is doing. Because if your baby is really struggling with tummy time and you've tried, some things, but maybe there are others that you haven't considered, or your baby, same kind of example, your baby is struggling with tummy time and, you've spoken to other friends or other healthcare professionals and they're like, oh, don't worry about it. Your baby will just get there in time. I want to show you how you can support that baby in their tummy time, because that's what's going to come before rolling, as an example. So really just educating parents on, okay, this is what you're looking for in terms of order of development. And really, instead of worrying my baby isn't where, or my child isn't where other babies are, being like, okay, this is where my kid is at. This is the next step that I'm looking for. How do I help my baby or my child get there? And really being a listening ear for them, because I hear quite often that parents will tell me that they've spoken to other people or other professionals, and it's just like, oh, just wait, it'll get better. Just wait and see, they'll grow out of it. And I'm really much of the mindset of like, what are we waiting for? If there's tangible things that we can do to help that support that child and that family wherever they are, and they're non-intrusive and they're fun and they're educational, then why don't we just try it? Especially if the family can, especially if it's something that's tangible for the family financially, then let's give it a try.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about how important play is for child's development too. And I bet probably this approach also helps parents sort of ease their mind, because if they're stressed and nervous and projecting their insecurities and worries and comparisons,
let's talk about the emotions,
right?
The
That can be
dynamics
good.
of parents. I'm sure you come in there, like you just mentioned, that heightened anxiety when the parent shows up, or if it's a first like mom, like with her first baby, and like that anxiety. There's always like, sometimes too, I think children can feed off of that energy as well, right? So
absolutely, because babies are not. And it's funny because most people are not aware of this. Babies don't come with manuals, and families do so much prep for the birth and the first couple of days, but there's a huge disconnect, I find. And then you just get this baby, and then what, right? There's not very much education about, okay, I get this baby, and I know that theoretically I'm supposed to put them on their back to sleep, and I'm supposed to feed X number of times, and maybe I'm supposed to do tummy time, but there isn't enough, in my opinion, support for these new families. Okay, but how do you do this? How do you breastfeed? Because that's not an easy endeavor. How do you support your child in tummy time? Because that's so tricky. And so I really also feel like after I became a mom myself, I was able to empathize with families a lot more. And now when I'm talking to families about finding this balance and how they can incorporate these activities in their day-to-day lives, I'm more mindful of what their actual experience is. And I can use really tangible examples from my own life. Like I had this baby, and even though this is my very first time 7 years ago, even though I knew so much about childhood development, I still struggled. And I was always going to Google, and my husband would always tell me, like, that's not the place to go, right? Like find community in other places. Worst case scenarios are and now I can share that with families, and it feels really good because the moms come, and the moms are worried typically, and the dads are telling me, oh, she's always on Google. And I'm like, no, don't. Google is the place where hopes and dreams go to die. Find a professional, find someone that you trust to help you find the answers instead. That's what community is for. And I feel really lucky that I get to be there for families in that way. It feels like I'm giving back to families what I feel like I really needed when I was a first-time mom.
Yeah. That connection piece too, for sure.
And I wonder if that stress that they feel, like, how does that affect the nervous system of the baby?
Yeah, great question. So
like slower or more?
Well, we talk about even in the community, we talk about, moms, when they're dysregulated and their own nervous systems are dysregulated, it is going to cause a dysregulation in your own child's experiences as well. So how do you find that you're supporting them to understand that concept as well? Like, do you offer anything for the mom as well when they're like, coming in and maybe you're feeling that too? You're like, okay.
I actually run, it's called Babies at Play, which is a parent baby class. it's a 6-week program. I have 2 levels. I have level 0 to 6 months and then 6 to 12. I didn't come up with the program. An occupational therapist that I work with did, and then I've kind of adapted it and I offer it at all the locations that I work at. And the idea is I teach parents how to play and interact with their babies, right? But the beginning of the class is always just us sharing, highs and lows that happened over the past week, so they can feel supported. And it's helpful for families to see that we're all kind of going through the same thing. It might look a little bit different, but parenthood is insane. And, you need families to be like, okay, like this crazy thing happened. And then someone else in the group is typically like, oh yeah, that happened to me 2 years ago, 2 weeks ago, just yesterday. And so we kind of go through the struggle together. And then the other thing is just providing the education to the families. So, a really important piece, and I think impactful piece of information that I share right off the bat in the first class is that a child's nervous system actually functions 10 times slower than that of an adult, particularly in the first 6 months. But depending on your baby, that could last 1 year to 18 months. So if your baby is really overstimulated, and it doesn't take much for an infant, right? Like maybe the TV is on loud, you have a toddler that's in the same room as you, or the parent is feeling really anxious, that's really going to impact the baby. So then I talk about, what do you look for? Your baby is crying, they're not making eye contact, they may be more agitated than usual. So these are the things to look for, and then how to help. And the first step is almost always to take a step back yourself, take a deep breath, leave the room. And it's not easy. And I make sure parents understand that. I'm not judging you if you're feeling really anxious, because I had really bad postpartum anxiety and depression with my first. So I get what it's like, and it's not easy to step away. But if you can just take 1 minute and take a deep breath and then go back and assess the situation, it feels much calmer. And so we actually, after we share our highs and lows from the past week, we take 1 minute as a group and we do some deep breathing with our eyes closed, and we center ourselves before we jump into the class, so we can kind of put that into practice, regulating ourselves, even if it's just for a moment, before we jump in and try to support our children.
Yeah.
So further to this, I feel like I will follow up, because you mentioned how fight or flight, and I guess if you as a parent feel fight or flight, the baby will pick it up, and how that can impact and cause constipation, some urinary incontinence, and it could also lead to social isolation. I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that.
That's like, I like my first thought goes into like the adults that I work with. And then you think about when you're doing like inner child work, and like you're going into those parts of like the baby version of yourself, and like, and that like that point of dysregulation, or them being in that fight or flight response and still having those issues as an adult, like constipation, or constantly being in that fight or flight response. So yeah, I'm very curious more about like the baby aspect.
Yeah, and the link.
Yeah.
So I usually see it when the child is a little bit older. So I treat constipation and urinary incontinence after they've been toilet learned, we like to call it, because toilet trained, and this is a totally another topic, but toilet train is like you're teaching the kid, okay, hold it until you see a toilet, versus we teach toilet learning, so that the child learns to feel the urges on their own and then go to the washroom. So I see this constipation and urinary incontinence in older children. That's where I treat it in, typically older than 5. And so just physiologically, from that kind of standpoint, when we are stressed and we are worried and we're in that fight or flight state, we are not going to have a bowel movement, and we actually cannot consciously control urine. So we're gonna urinate more often, okay? Versus when we're in the opposite, the rest and digest, we can be calm enough to have a bowel movement, and we have more conscious control of our urine. So the way that I use to describe it to the children that come and see me, so that, it can be easily digestible for them and for parents as well. When we are, and it's funny, but it's true, and all the kids always laugh about it, but when you're worried about anything, a test coming up, your parents being upset at you for something, maybe you're in a fight with your friend, it doesn't matter. Your body is panicking, right? It's worried about something. it imagines a bear is attacking, because that's what our body is used to. That's where that fight or flight came from, right? It came from us wanting to protect our bodies, wanting to protect ourselves, right? So when we're worried about something, a child, and they're sitting on the toilet, there's a bear in the bathroom with them. And I always say, if a bear is trying to attack you, is that going to be a good time to stop and have a poo? And the kids laugh, because obviously it isn't, right? They're not going to want to sit and have a poo if a bear is attacking. Yeah. So I try to explain to parents and to family and to the children that if we want our bodies to feel safe enough to have that poo and get out of that fight or flight and into that rest or digest, we need to calm ourselves down. And maybe the bear doesn't disappear altogether, but it's at least going to go out of the bathroom for those few short minutes. And there's so much of a connection between a child being in that fight or flight and a parent being in as well. And it's always for the best intentions. But if your 5, 6, 10, 12-year-old is having bowel incontinence or urinary incontinence, they are not going to want to be around their friends. They're not going to want to go and have sleepovers. They're going to struggle and worry so much about how this impacts their day-to-day. And so you as a parent, you're just trying to help, but you're reminding them, go to the bathroom. Did you go to the bathroom? Did you have an accident? And you're asking them all the time, right? Yeah, you're trying to help, right? and you know, your intentions are always good. So I really want to make sure that parents know that too. And that's why that education piece when it comes to urinary incontinence and constipation is so important. It's most of what I do, talking about that fight or flight, but also kind of breaking that cycle, because they get caught in that cycle of perpetual worry, the child and the parent. And then, you know, you really need to kind of intervene at every point along that cycle to make the resolution successful. And so it's getting parents and children to get out of that fight or flight and to really reimagine how they see that whole situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm like, again, I can visualize my whole childhood. It's like one of those moments, like it was such a, like I felt growing up, it was always rushed. Everything was always rushed. There wasn't enough time. It was always like, gotta go, you gotta go. So there wasn't any time to give like myself as a little kid, the opportunity to go to the bathroom.
Right.
Right. And then, you know, and then I also grew up where like I had social anxiety as a kid. I mean, granted, I know it's also because of my intuition and my gifts and all the other things that I kind of, you know, seeing people have crossed over, and like there's other layers to children's anxiety and whatever else, right? But at school, I would have accidents and I was 6, right? And the shame and the embarrassment of that, right? Because my mother was somebody who was high strung all the time, and it was a lot, right? So even now as an adult, if I have any form of anxiety, like you were mentioning, that worry or that fight or flight type of response, granted, it's even more a more sensitive person in general. Like I know I'm not going to the bathroom. Like it's going to be like so I relate to like this conversation.
That's why they say, like, you know, I'm sure you've heard anal retentive, right? Type A personalities, people who are more like organized, hypervigilant, anxious in general. We call them anal retentive. That's because of the changes that you see in a pelvic floor. If you're a nervous person, you're going to be clenched all the time. And a lot of people think like, oh, well, if my pelvic floor is always clenched, it must be strong, but that's not true.
No, it isn't.
Any muscle in the body that is too tight or too loose is not going to be strong because it's not in the right alignment to do what it needs to do. So even just giving that piece of information that, you know, this might be something that your child always kind of struggles with, because if you do have constipation and urinary incontinence as a child, you're more likely to experience it later on. But if you give them the tools, if they learn how to do deep breathing, if they learn how to properly sit on the toilet, these are all skills that they can then take with them for a lifetime. And then speaking to that piece about always running around, our bodies are functioning on a cycle. And so typically speaking, although not always, adults will have and if they're having one bowel movement a day, it'll typically be in the morning. And for children, it's typically in the evening or after school. But where are kids after school now? They're at their activities, running around. And that's not a bad thing, because socialization, physical activity is really important. But you just need to be kind of aware of that and make sure that your child is either comfortable having a bowel movement at whatever activity they're at, or you've scheduled a little bit of time, 5 minutes to sit on a toilet at another time of their day, kind of after a meal, so that your child doesn't become constipated or doesn't start to back up, because then it kind of snowballs from there.
Right. Yeah. like scheduling that for a child so that there's an awareness of training the mind and the body to get on board with this process. It's like that connection piece, right? Because there is like the mind gut connection too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And at certain times, right, you're not going to just sit on the toilet, you know, for endlessly at random times of the day, but we know that there's a gastrocolic reflex. So when we eat a meal, our digestive system gets triggered to start doing what it needs to do to make room for that new food, right? So 20-ish minutes later is when we ideally should be having a bowel movement. So if after school is not a good time for your child, maybe you schedule that 5 minutes in the morning after breakfast or wherever it's going to work. Maybe they have a snack after their after school activities and that's when it happens. But then, you know, they're sitting in the washroom just for 5 minutes, nothing more than that. But, you know, no devices, nothing that's going to heighten their system, because then again, you're going into that fight or flight. So when you're sitting in the toilet doing what you got to do, that's what you're doing. That's your job. No phones, no iPads. You're taking the time to calm yourself down and allow your body to just like be where it needs to be and do what it needs to do, which is actually the case kind of for all of the milestones that I talk about. You're in tummy time, then try to be on the ground with your baby, doing that tummy time with them. Be present, be in the moment, because that's the best way that you're going to help your child work through these struggles and these milestones, is just by being there.
I guess you're teaching them presence, and you're also regulating yourself and them because you're present in whatever activity you're doing with them.
Yes. And that's most of the time what a baby or an older child wants, right? Like that in infancy, they're not even interested in toys for the first 2, 3, 4 months of their life, sometimes longer. You can shake any rattle you want, but what they want to see is a human face. They want to see you. So, you know, the easiest thing to do would just be like, take that 5 minutes, get down on the ground and do tummy time with them, because they want your face more than they want anything else.
Yeah. There's another interesting thing you mentioned. You said crawling was removed as a milestone. So are people, I just want to understand. So are people just going straight to walking? Like,
well, my niece
hurrying
did that,
their children
right?
over,
My
like,
niece did that. My niece actually, she was amazing at like the rolling. Like, within, I don't know, I think it was about 4 months, maybe. She was already kind of like, oh, okay, whatever. And she did not want to crawl. And then she just lifted herself up and then slowly started walking. But I don't know if that's I mean, she did some of that scooting, like a little bit of the scooting for a while, but it was like to scoot to go grab and then stand and then like take some steps.
This is one of my very favorite things to talk about. I love crawling. Crawling is
like
really,
eyes lit up.
I know.
I was like, okay.
I know. So they removed crawling as a milestone because a lot of babies stopped doing it. They stopped. So it used to be, we're looking, and when we started, I talked about the order of developmental milestones within that very first year. And so what we are looking for is a baby gets really, really good at tummy time. Then they roll, then they crawl, then they sit, then they stand and walk. So that's kind of the order that we want milestones, ideally, in the best case scenario, to occur in. And that's because milestones are magically, you know, through the grace of, you know, the higher powers, God, in my opinion, designed to happen that way, where one naturally builds on the other. And so if your child gets really, really good at tummy time and, you know, there's no side preference, there's nothing else going on, as long as they spend plenty of time on the floor, you'll see that they're going to actually move through those milestones naturally without needing any kind of intervention. The problem is that early tummy time is not the same anymore. So when we were born before the 90s, we were put to sleep on our tummies overnight, and we napped on our tummies during the day, and our parents didn't have any of these fancy devices. So when they were not holding us, we survived. They put us on our tummies to sleep, to play. So we were on our tummies, research suggests, like 18 hours a day on average out of 24. Okay. But nowadays they are put on, which is definitely the safest place to be, right? And they nap on their backs. The problem is when the Back to Sleep campaign started in the 90s, it was back to sleep, tummy to play. There was a lot of information and support on, okay, this is how much tummy time your child should be doing, what it should look like, this is how to support them. And these are the reasons why. And that kind of stopped. Now they just tell parents, put them on their backs to sleep, do some tummy time. But then it doesn't really go further than that for a lot of families. So an article that I read suggests that now it's about 30 minutes of tummy time compared to the 18 hours that we did. And I actually think that's an overestimate, because most families that I speak to will say like, oh yeah, we do tummy time maybe once a day, twice a day. We get to it for about 5 minutes. And so they're not really doing very much tummy time. They eventually will learn to roll, but parents are putting their babies into sitting instead of allowing them to crawl and then get into sitting on their own, which is what we would have done, what we would expect to see, right? So a baby crawls and then they get into sitting.
And why is that important to do?
Yeah, okay. That transitional, yes. So, okay, that transitional movement, that crawling into sitting, it builds a lot of core strength and coordination. That crawling movement actually helps with the development of your pelvic floor and your diaphragm, the shape and the function of it. Right. It actually helps with sensory development. So you're seeing the world from a different perspective. It gives information to your vestibular and your proprioceptive systems, your sense of vision, your sense of touch. Yeah, it also helps crawling also helps the development of your hand form and function. Wow. It's the first time the two halves of your brain have to communicate with each other, because before that, it's very much like right side and left side in isolation. But when you crawl, the two halves are communicating. So there's lots of reasons. There's more even than that. But crawling is your first exposure to all of those things. So if you crawl and then get into sitting, not only are you developing all of those skills, but you're also developing independence. The child can then get in and out of any position they want and explore their environment, right?
It's like the foundation almost, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
This is how we survive. There's your answer.
Yeah, exactly. Because we explored around, right? But if you just put your baby into sitting, which is what I see all the time now, they don't have to learn how to crawl. They don't want to, because once they sit, that's way easier than tummy time. It's way easier than crawling. Some kids will bump scoot, but some will not even, and they'll just kind of sit into sitting. Eventually they will walk. And even if a child does present with struggles later on that I see that are associated to not crawling, it's fine. That's one of the best parts about pediatric physiotherapy. I can always go back. You know what I mean? Like, you tell me that you didn't crawl and you have constipation. I know there's a link there. But then we just do hands and knees activities for strengthening. We find other ways to work on it. But yeah, crawling was removed as a milestone because babies were not achieving it, not because it didn't have all of these benefits. And if you speak to anybody in the pediatric community, we're like, no, make sure every baby crawls. Right. When I see babies bump scooting, I just want to like give them my card and be like, please come and see me. Even if your baby keeps bump scooting and never uses crawling as their primary way to get around, I at least want to make sure they have the arm strength and the mobility to get between positions, and they spend some time on hands and knees.
Could there be like just like as a like add-on to them, like could gymnastics be helpful, or like ballet, like if they were to put them in like certain programs?
Yes.
Like,
yeah.
Like the age of, like, let's say they didn't crawl, but you know, you wanted your kid to develop those fundamentals, right?
Yeah.
Gymnastics and like, or ballet dance or anything like that really help with that question a little bit?
So the activities that I always recommend the most to all children, gymnastics, martial arts, and swimming. Typically, from my experience, they're the exercises that are the activities that are going to promote balance, coordination, strengthening the best. And then, you know, I always tell families, if people are asking me this question, oh, my kid didn't crawl. Maybe she or he is presenting with some of the things that you're mentioning. You can always come for an assessment or contact a pediatric physiotherapist. Like, my kid didn't crawl, or they did crawl. Now they're constipated, or they really struggle to go through toilet learning. And then there's no harm, in my opinion, of just getting an assessment. Maybe you come and your kid is totally fine. You move on with your life. Maybe there is some coordination or some strengthening pieces that are missing. And again, this is whether or not your child's crawled. Crawling isn't going to, you know, solve all the world's problems. Right. But there's no harm, in my opinion, to be like, okay, yeah, my kid is fine. Or maybe they need a little bit of work with their balance. And it doesn't mean, my goal is never to have you coming to see me for the rest of their life. If it's a simple fix, I give you some activities, maybe I do 1 or 2 follow-ups, you're on your way. And the activities are always going to be fun and play-based, and something that the whole family can really participate in. And if you come and see me in center for therapy, again, it's toys and it's fun and it's play-based. So it's a really non-intrusive way, if you have any concerns with your child's development, to really support them.
Yeah, that's great.
I always like to end on more of a personal question. So I'm curious, how has this work impacted you personally? How has that impacted even your inner child work that you're doing as part of being, you know, a Soul Thrive member, and just even your own spirituality or evolution?
Yeah, I love that. That's a good question.
Must be very triggering at times.
You know, actually, I did this job. I started this job, and I always knew growing up that I wanted to work with children. I wanted to work in the medical field. I didn't really know how. I thought maybe I was going to be a pediatrician, and then, you know, I didn't really know. And so I go through undergrad, and someone that was in my life at the time was considering physiotherapy. I did some volunteer work, and I was like, oh, I feel like this is a really tangible way that I can make a difference. And you really get to know clients, because that was piece that I really wanted. I wanted to not just be like a blip in their life. I wanted to have a connection for an extended period of time. And then when I realized that you could do it in pediatrics, I was like, I'm sold. This. I've never not known that I wanted to do pediatric physiotherapy ever since I got into the program. And at first, I really didn't know why, if I'm being honest. And I did it for a decade, and I knew that I loved it. I knew that I had a passion for it, kind of not knowing why. And I will say, before I started this work, I loved the idea that in my head, I was like, oh, this makes me a good person. Like, I needed that validation. It's almost like I really tied that to my identity, right? Like, my job is treating children with disabilities. That must mean that I'm so good. That's the example. That's the reason, the proof. And then once I started my own like healing work and really started going into my own journey, I was really able to separate that from my job. And so I have other things that I help to identify who I am and why I'm really separate from my job. But it actually hasn't changed how much I love my job. And I think I understand, I love it more. Play is really important to me. I have fun, and I love that. And I love that I get to be a part of a family's journey. I love that I get to witness milestones. I get to be there when kids take their first steps, and I get to be there when they crawl for the first time, or I get to help a teenager, you know, no longer suffer from urinary incontinence, and they can go away to sleepaway camp. That feels really fulfilling, being a part of someone's journey and doing it in a really supportive and fun way. So it brings me joy, and it allows me to play every day. Sometimes it can be difficult, especially never with the children. Sometimes it's usually with the parents, right? Because I have to be there for them in a supportive way. And often, I mean, I'm sure if you guys have ever had a massage, you might have experienced this, but you know, when you're on the table or you're in that therapy session, families divulge a lot of information. So that can sometimes be tricky, especially if it's a day where I'm not feeling particularly grounded myself. But I've never felt like it wasn't worth it. I've never considered switching jobs. This is like, I really just have always known this is where I'm meant to be. It's what I'm meant to do. It's how I'm meant to contribute. One of the ways in which I'm meant to contribute to this world.
Yeah. So that's just your tie to your joy and your inner child. Yeah. And this is also healing you on so many levels as well. I think your own personal journey with your own personal struggles, it gives you the opportunity to really bridge that gap as well. Yeah. And like, as much as you're doing what you're doing for your clients, you're also nurturing that inner child version of you that wanted that support or that or to be heard or to be valued, or just like overall just being able to play.
Exactly. Right? To play and to educate, right? Play with the babies, educate the parents, and be that support system, even if it's for a blip of their life, to be that support system for a family when, when they need it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on our podcast.
Oh, you're welcome. This was so fun.
This was great. Yeah. We appreciate all the information.
Learned a lot.
Yeah, learned a lot. And we will definitely have you back on here again for sure.
Yeah. And if I can add like one more thing, if it's okay.
Yeah.
Any caregiver or parent, if you have any questions, you don't only have to contact me, but if you're if ever you're wondering, okay, maybe like this, my child is doing this or not doing this, I'm not sure, don't go to Google. Don't, or any like parent forum, you know what I mean? And type it in. Just
we'll have we'll have all your contact info so they'll be able to follow you. Ask you
find someone
questions.
who's willing to listen and support you and you know, give you an honest answer. And that's the community that is really, really important for caregivers of any kind.
I agree. That's perfect. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.